On September 11, 1380, as the Black Death continued to cast its shadow over northern Europe, the 40-year-old King of Norway, Haakon VI, collapsed in fever and delirium. He did not fall on the battlefield, but to the same plague that had already erased half his kingdom. His sudden death did more than silence a young monarch. It signaled the unraveling of Norway's independence, pushing the nation into centuries of entanglement and obscurity within the shifting alliances of Scandinavia. In the year 1340, the Kingdom of Norway was already a land of contradictions. It was a kingdom rich in coastline and sagas, yet weakened by centuries of dynastic bargaining. Into this fragile world, Haakon Magnusson was born. Unlike other children who first learned to crawl across wooden floors and chase after the warmth of the hearth, Haakon's cradle was placed inside a palace where shadows of crowns and thrones loomed heavier than any lullaby. He was not born into childhood. He was born into history. At the age of 3, before most children could form clear sentences, Haakon was placed on Norway's throne. His father, Magnus IV, still sat as King of Sweden, unwilling to loosen his grip on the dual crowns he had once tried to unite. The coronation of the boy was less an act of celebration than a move on a chessboard. Haakon became a pawn dressed as a king, a symbol of Norwegian autonomy in a game dominated by older, stronger hands. Those early years of Haakon's reign were ruled not by his own will, but by regents and counselors. Documents bore his name, but decisions were made by others. To the people, their king was a child, whose portrait adorned seals, but whose voice was never heard in council halls. To foreign rulers, he was a placeholder, a flickering candle in a drafty corridor, waiting to be snuffed out or carried away by stronger winds. The weight of expectation fell on him long before he could understand it. Chroniclers of the time describe Haakon's youth as a life confined within layers of duty. While other boys might measure their strength with play, he measured his existence by the sharp edges of treaties and the fragile peace between rival crowns. His tutors instructed him in Latin, scripture, and the laws of the realm, but every lesson carried a silent reminder: he was not his own. His life was a contract signed before his birth. The image of Haakon as a boy king lingers in the imagination like a candle burning at both ends. Too young to grasp the language of politics, yet too central to escape it, he was raised as if he were both child and sovereign, son and hostage. In the sagas, heroes earn their crowns through battles fought and journeys endured. Haakon's saga began with no sword in hand, but with a fragile crown lowered onto his head, a crown far heavier than he could carry. Norway itself mirrored his condition. The kingdom was beautiful but precarious. Its mountains and fjords gave it natural defenses, yet its small population and weakened economy made it vulnerable to the ambitions of Denmark and Sweden. As Haakon grew, so too did the fractures within his inheritance. He embodied the paradox of a king with little control, a sovereign watched over by a father who refused to yield, and by nobles who whispered of alliances and betrayals. Looking back, it is tempting to see destiny already etched in those early years. A boy raised more as a symbol than a person, a king enthroned before he could walk steadily, a life bound by treaties rather than freedom. Haakon VI entered the world not as a child of chance, but as a figure already pressed into the mold of dynastic necessity. His life would never belong to him. It belonged to Norway, and to the larger forces of plague, politics, and history that waited just beyond the horizon. For most sons, a father's presence is a source of protection. For Haakon VI, it was a constant weight. His father, Magnus IV of Sweden, called Magnus Eriksson, was a man unwilling to loosen his grasp on power. Even after placing a crown on his 3-year-old son's head, Magnus continued to rule Norway as if it were still his own. The young king's every step was measured against his father's long shadow. The relationship between Haakon and Magnus was not one of gentle guidance. It was an uneasy partnership, more political than paternal. Haakon, even as he grew into adolescence, remained tethered to the decisions of his father, a king who still insisted on controlling two realms at once. It was as if Magnus viewed his son not as an heir, but as an extension of his own ambition, a second set of hands meant to hold crowns that Magnus could not balance alone. As Haakon matured, this tension deepened. Imagine the halls of council. Haakon, now a youth with his own voice, attempting to assert authority, only to find his father's envoys seated at the table, undermining his words with the authority of the older king. Norway's nobles, caught between loyalty to the father and obligation to the son, often played one against the other. The realm, instead of uniting under a clear monarch, became a chessboard of divided loyalties. Chroniclers hint at moments of bitterness between father and son. Magnus, who once tried and failed to hold Sweden and Norway together, resented the idea of being pushed aside. Haakon, desperate to define himself beyond his father's will, found himself hemmed in. What should have been a smooth passing of the torch became a tug of war, with Norway itself as the rope. The people suffered most in this struggle. Civil unrest simmered, and disputes between rival factions of the nobility dragged the kingdom into periodic conflict. Farmers left their fields to join skirmishes. Merchants watched their trade falter as insecurity spread across the land. For ordinary Norwegians, the feud between father and son felt like a quarrel of giants, whose footsteps shook the earth beneath them. The image of Haakon in these years is of a young man, pacing corridors lined with tapestries of ancestors, feeling their eyes upon him. He was king in name, yet treated as little more than a prince under his father's command. The throne he sat upon seemed more like a borrowed chair than a rightful seat. His crown, though visible to the world, felt invisible in his own hands. And yet, these struggles forged a resolve in him. The boy king of Norway began to see the cost of compromise and the danger of divided rule. He understood, through years of humiliation and frustration, that power could not be shared without fracture. Like iron tempered in fire, his identity as king hardened in resistance to his father's dominance. But the damage was already done. The years of dual rule had drained Norway's strength. The nobles had learned to play the crown against itself, and the people had grown weary of uncertainty. Magnus's heavy hand and Haakon's frustrated youth had left the kingdom vulnerable, a fortress with cracks spreading through its foundations. In the end, the shadow of Magnus was not simply the burden of a father's authority. It was the shadow of a whole generation of failed unity, a father who refused to let go, and a son who struggled to step fully into the light. That shadow would never fully fade. It followed Haakon into every treaty, every council, every decision he would make. He would spend his reign not only battling foreign enemies, but also wrestling with the ghost of his father's ambition. In 1363, when Haakon was 23 years old, the path of his life took a decisive turn. That year, he married Margaret of Denmark, the daughter of King Valdemar IV. To some, it was a triumph of diplomacy. To Haakon, it was another reminder that a king's heart was never truly his own. His marriage was not chosen in a moment of affection, but arranged on the great chessboard of Northern Europe, where every union of blood was a calculated stroke of strategy. The ceremony itself was grand, the kind that filled cathedrals with incense and song. Chroniclers describe golden vestments and solemn vows echoing beneath vaulted ceilings. Yet beneath the splendor lay the hard truth. This marriage was a treaty in disguise. By wedding Margaret, Haakon tied Norway's fate to Denmark's, binding two kingdoms by the fragile thread of matrimony. He was not just taking a wife. He was accepting an alliance that would shape the course of Scandinavia. Margaret was only 10 years old at the time. A child bride in a world where women's futures were written long before their own hands could hold the pen. Haakon, though older, was still finding his footing as a ruler, still scarred by years under his father's shadow. Their union was less a meeting of equals than the sealing of a contract. Yet, over time, Margaret would grow into a figure of formidable strength, one who would eventually eclipse her husband in fame and power. For Haakon, this marriage carried hope as well as burden. Hope that an alliance with Denmark could stabilize Norway against the threats of Sweden and the growing might of the Hanseatic League. Burden because it meant surrendering a measure of sovereignty, binding his kingdom's survival to the ambitions of another crown. It was as though he had secured a shield against enemies, but at the price of carrying an anchor. The years following the marriage revealed Margaret's keen intellect. Though young, she absorbed politics with an ease that startled even seasoned courtiers. She learned to maneuver within courts where words were sharper than swords, and where silence could carry more power than proclamation. Haakon, accustomed to being overshadowed, first by his father, now by the alliance itself, found himself both strengthened and diminished. His kingdom gained security, but his own role as sovereign seemed increasingly defined by the people around him. Still, their union brought one undeniable joy. In 1370, Margaret bore a son, Olaf. To Haakon, Olaf was not only an heir, but a promise that Norway's crown might endure despite famine, plague, and political storms. The birth of the boy was celebrated with bells and feasts. Yet even in that moment of triumph, the kingdom's fragility was clear. A single child carried the hopes of two realms. His small heartbeat echoed with the weight of dynasties. Looking back, historians see this marriage as the spark that ignited the great Scandinavian transformation. Through it, Margaret would eventually rise to rule Denmark, Norway, and later Sweden, forging what became the Kalmar Union. Haakon, however, never lived to see the full arc of her power. His role in the story was both essential and tragic. The king who made the alliance, but did not survive long enough to benefit from it. The marriage alliance of 1363 was, in many ways, a mirror of Haakon's life itself. Brilliant in appearance, fragile in substance, a bond that promised strength, yet foreshadowed loss. The king, who had grown beneath the heavy shadow of his father, now found himself standing beside a wife destined to cast a shadow of her own. The reign of Haakon VI was never painted on a canvas of stability. From the beginning, Norway itself resembled a ship already leaking as it left the harbor, its timbers creaking under the strain of storms, both internal and external. By the 1370s, the cracks in this vessel were impossible to ignore. Norway was not a kingdom preparing for glory. It was a kingdom struggling to remain afloat. The Black Death had first swept across the country in 1349, arriving by ship from England. It devoured the population with a hunger that seemed bottomless. In a single year, nearly half of Norway's people vanished. Entire farms were abandoned, churches emptied, towns silenced. Villages that once rang with the laughter of children became graveyards where no voices lingered. And unlike a fire that dies once its fuel is gone, the plague lingered like a recurring nightmare, striking again in waves that left the land thinner with each return. By Haakon's time, Norway was a country haunted by absence. The silence of missing laborers echoed louder than any bell. Vast stretches of farmland turned wild, overtaken by weeds and forests, reclaiming what humans had once tamed. Empty homesteads stood like broken teeth across the countryside. Reminders that the land itself was outliving its people. What use was a crown when there were fewer hands to build, fewer bodies to defend, fewer voices to sing allegiance? Economically, the kingdom reeled. The Hanseatic League, that great mercantile power stretching across the Baltic and North Seas, exploited Norway's weakness. Its merchants, well-organized, disciplined, and backed by fleets of ships, dominated trade in Bergen and other coastal towns. Where once Norwegian merchants carried their own goods, now German traders dictated prices and terms, treating Norway not as a partner, but as a dependency. Timber, fish, and hides, the lifeblood of Norwegian trade, were siphoned away under unfavorable contracts. Each ship that left Bergen's harbor seemed to carry more of Norway's sovereignty with it. The countryside, meanwhile, grew restless. With fewer farmers to till the soil, famine struck in cycles. The survivors bore scars of hunger alongside scars of grief. Many looked to their king for relief, but Haakon could do little to reverse forces larger than himself. The land was bleeding, and he held no cure. His authority was increasingly symbolic, a fragile banner raised above a kingdom weary from blows of plague and poverty. And yet, Haakon was no idle figure. He attempted to shore up his crumbling realm, to reinforce the splintering timbers of his ship. He negotiated with the Hanseatic merchants, sometimes pushing back against their demands, sometimes forced to concede. He sought to maintain alliances through his marriage to Margaret, hoping that Denmark's stability might provide Norway with borrowed strength. He held councils, dispatched envoys, and issued decrees. But every act was like patching holes in a hull battered by waves that refused to cease. The struggles of the kingdom seeped into Haakon's personal life as well. His marriage, while politically vital, offered little respite. Margaret's growing presence in Scandinavian politics meant Haakon was often measured not only against his father's legacy, but also against his wife's brilliance. She was quick to read the winds of power, while he seemed forever fighting against currents beyond his command. The contrast became clear even to foreign observers. Norway's king was fighting to keep balance, while Denmark's princess queen-in-waiting was quietly preparing to lead. The symbolism of the time is striking. Chroniclers tell of long winters when the fjords froze early, ships stranded in ice like insects trapped in amber. It was as though nature itself conspired with history to remind Norwegians of their fragility. Haakon's reign was cast not in the golden tones of triumph, but in the gray palette of endurance. He was not remembered for conquest, but for survival, for holding on while the tide pulled stronger and stronger against him. The image of Norway in this era is that of a candle flickering in a drafty church. Each time the wind blew through the open doors, be it plague, famine, or foreign exploitation, the flame guttered dangerously low. Haakon's role was to cup his hands around it, shielding what little light remained. But a man's hands can only do so much when the storm refuses to die. There were moments, of course, when hope seemed possible. The birth of Olaf in 1370 was celebrated as a symbol that Norway still had a future. Bells rang, banners flew, prayers were offered. Yet the joy of the child's cry could not drown out the silence of the thousands who had been buried without heirs, without legacies. One life could not replace so many gone. And when famine struck again in the years after Olaf's birth, the contrast between royal celebrations and peasant suffering became painfully stark. Haakon's Norway was also trapped in geography. The mountains and fjords that gave it beauty also isolated its people, making communication and governance slow. While Denmark could consolidate power across its flat, fertile lands, and Sweden could draw upon its vast resources, Norway's fragmented landscape mirrored its fragmented politics. A message sent from Oslo might take weeks to reach a distant valley, if it arrived at all. The kingdom felt less like a unified nation than a scattering of communities tenuously bound by allegiance to a king struggling in Oslo. Foreign observers saw weakness and prepared to exploit it. Denmark, through Margaret, tightened its influence. The Hanseatic League entrenched itself further. Even Sweden, fractured as it was, remained a looming presence. To them, Norway was less a rival than a prize. A land rich in resources, but poor in defenders. A kingdom that could be absorbed into larger designs. For Haakon, ruling in such circumstances was like walking across ice that threatened to crack with every step. Each decision risked collapse. Each compromise carried the danger of further erosion. Yet to do nothing was worse. His reign, then, became a balancing act, a tightrope stretched across centuries of history, swaying under the weight of plague, famine, and politics. By the late 1370s, Norway's decline was no longer whispered but spoken openly. Chroniclers wrote of abandoned farms, of noble families extinguished by the plague, of cities shrinking into little more than fortified villages. The once proud kingdom had become a shadow of itself, its strength bled away by death and dependence. Haakon himself must have felt the tragedy of it. He had inherited a throne at the age of 3, grown beneath the heavy shadow of his father. Married into a dynasty that bound his fate to Denmark. And now, as a mature king, he watched his country wither before his eyes. He was a ruler who sought to lead, yet he seemed destined to preside over decline. Norway under Haakon VI was not a kingdom preparing to rise. It was a kingdom bracing for the inevitable. Like a ship caught in a storm too vast to outrun, it was forced to endure until timbers gave way. And in that endurance, Haakon's reign carried both its nobility and its tragedy. The nobility of persistence, the tragedy of inevitability. Haakon VI's life was lived in the tug-of-war between duty and desire, between the personal role of a man and the public mask of a king. For most rulers, these roles often blend. But for Haakon, they stood apart like parallel tracks that never truly met. He was called to be sovereign over a fractured kingdom. Yet, in his heart, he longed to be father and husband, to hold his family close in a world collapsing around him. The marriage to Margaret of Denmark, first a political contract, gradually became a companionship of resilience. Margaret, though much younger, grew into her role with an intelligence that even Haakon's counselors came to respect. She was sharp, cautious, and deliberate, a woman who could turn silence into authority. While many rulers shouted to be heard, Margaret's presence commanded attention even when she said little. Haakon, accustomed to being overshadowed, first by his father, then by foreign powers, found in Margaret both a partner and a mirror. She reflected his strengths when he doubted himself, and she revealed his weaknesses when he tried to ignore them. In 1370, their son Olaf was born. The event was celebrated as more than the arrival of a royal child. It was a collective sigh of relief for a kingdom desperate for continuity. Church bells rang through Oslo, banners fluttered from towers, and peasants offered prayers for the infant who would one day wear a crown. For Haakon, Olaf was not merely an heir. He was a beacon, a fragile flame in the darkened halls of Norway's destiny. To be a father while being a king was a paradox. With one hand, Haakon cradled his infant son. With the other, he signed decrees that bore the weight of a nation's survival. His personal joy was laced with public anxiety. He knew too well the burdens of inheriting a crown too soon. Watching Olaf's tiny hands, he must have wondered whether those hands would be forced, as his own had been, to grip a scepter before they were ready. Chroniclers describe Haakon as a ruler who, despite his kingdom's weakness, retained a sense of personal dignity. He was not remembered as cruel or extravagant, but as steady, deliberate, even cautious. He lacked the brilliance of a conqueror, but he also lacked the vanity that so often consumes kings. In him, the people saw a sovereign who tried to negotiate, tried to preserve, tried to hold his realm together even as disease and famine gnawed at its edges. He was less a blazing torch than a steady lamp, its light dim but persistent against the winds. Yet fatherhood brought with it a new layer of fear. Every cough from Olaf, every fever, must have struck Haakon's heart with dread. The memory of the plague still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. He had seen entire families vanish in a season. He had walked through villages where doors hung open and no one returned to close them. To raise a son in such a world was not only a gift, but a gamble. As husband, too, Haakon bore contradictions. He admired Margaret's sharp mind, yet he knew that her political instincts often surpassed his own. Observers began to note that she moved with a quiet confidence that he sometimes lacked. What began as a marriage of convenience was slowly tilting into a partnership where the Queen's voice grew ever louder. It was not open rivalry. Margaret was too skilled for that. But her influence was undeniable, and it raised whispers that perhaps she, not Haakon, would shape the future of Scandinavia. This dynamic left Haakon in a peculiar position. He was king, but his reign seemed to pass like a shadow over larger events. His father's lingering influence, the Hanseatic League's dominance, and his wife's growing stature. Even within his family, he sometimes seemed less the commanding figure and more the man caught in between. The son who could not escape his father, the husband who could not match his wife, the king who could not secure his throne. Still, there were moments of intimacy, small glimpses into the man behind the crown. Chronicles speak of him walking the halls of Akershus fortress, pausing to watch the fjord from its windows, his son in his arms. In such moments, he seemed less like a ruler and more like any father, haunted by what kind of world he was handing down. The fortress itself, with its cold stone and view over waters that carried both trade and plague, mirrored his own role. Defender of a realm constantly at risk. Guardian of a family caught in the tides of history. The metaphor of Haakon's reign is not that of a blazing comet, but of a man trying to hold two fragile vessels in balance, his kingdom and his family. Both were cracked, both threatened to sink, and both depended on his endurance. He was no conqueror who carved his legacy with swords. He was a caretaker, a custodian of survival in an age when survival itself was victory. But history is often cruel to such figures. Because he did not win great battles or expand his realm, Haakon is often overlooked. His reign is remembered less for triumphs than for losses, for the famine that returned, for the plague that never truly left, for the increasing influence of foreign merchants. His personal joys, his marriage, his son, are footnotes in a narrative dominated by decline. And yet, within those private moments, Haakon's humanity shines through. To be a father, husband, and king in the 14th century was to live at the crossroads of joy and terror. Every feast was shadowed by famine. Every baptism carried the memory of funerals. Every moment of hope stood on the fragile ground of despair. Haakon embodied this paradox. He was a man who cherished his family while watching his nation wither. A ruler who bore the title of king while knowing that history would measure him not by victories, but by survival. In the end, Haakon VI stood not as a heroic conqueror, but as a tragic caretaker. A man who tried to hold his child, his wife, and his country all at once, only to find that history's currents pulled each in different directions. He lived as both sovereign and supplicant, guardian and prisoner, father and orphaned son of a fading realm. The story of Norway in the 14th century cannot be told without returning again and again to the shadow of the plague. It was not a single catastrophe, but a recurring specter, rising from the earth like mist after rain. By the late 1370s, just as Haakon VI tried to stabilize his battered realm, the Black Death surged once more, as if history itself refused to release its grip. The first great wave of 1349 had already left scars deeper than any sword. Half the population had been swept away. Peasants, nobles, priests, even children in their cradles. Norway, once home to nearly 500,000 souls, now limped along with barely a fraction of that. But the plague was never satisfied. It returned in intervals, creeping into harbors with sailors, slipping into villages through trade, striking suddenly and leaving towns emptied overnight. In these years, survival itself became a fragile gamble. Chroniclers describe how entire valleys fell silent. A priest might travel through a region to find every farmstead deserted, doors swinging open, livestock wandering untended. Fields, once carefully plowed, grew wild again, grasses tall enough to swallow fences. Churches, too, stood abandoned, their altars covered in dust, their bells stilled because there were no living hands to ring them. For every candle lit in prayer, a dozen lives were extinguished. Haakon ruled a kingdom where absence was louder than presence. He sat in council chambers filled with half-empty benches because nobles had died and no heirs came to replace them. He issued decrees that traveled across the mountains only to find no one left to enforce them. Governance itself became like speaking into an echo chamber, his words drifting across a land where fewer and fewer people remained to listen. The plague did not discriminate. It felled peasants in the fields, merchants in the markets, monks in their cloisters. Even the nobility, once thought shielded by wealth and stone walls, found themselves just as vulnerable. In a world where power had always been measured by land and titles, the plague proved brutally democratic. All could be claimed, and none could bargain for escape. For Haakon, the resurgence of the disease was not only a political crisis, but a personal torment. He had lived his entire life in the shadow of its first wave, grown into manhood surrounded by reminders of loss. Now, as king, he faced the return of the same terror, this time with the awareness that he bore responsibility for a realm crumbling under its weight. He had a wife to protect, a son to guard, a kingdom to hold together. And yet, he could not shield them from the unseen hand of pestilence. Imagine the dread in Oslo when news arrived of ships docking with 6 sailors aboard. Panic spread faster than the disease itself. Families barricaded themselves inside homes, priests burned incense in the streets, and doctors, armed with masks of herbs and superstition, walked helplessly among the dying. Haakon's fortress became both palace and prison, a place where he and his court huddled against a storm that could not be seen but could be felt in every cough, every fever, every whisper of bad air. The language of the time was drenched in fear. People spoke of the plague as if it were a living creature, a raven circling the land, waiting to swoop down and feast. Others called it divine punishment, a scourge sent to remind humanity of its fragility. Haakon, bound by the teachings of the Church, must have wrestled with the same questions. Was this a curse for the sins of kings? A test of faith? Or simply the chaos of a world no ruler could master? The economic toll deepened. With each recurrence of plague, labor grew scarcer. Farmers abandoned marginal lands, retreating to only the most fertile valleys. Trade routes sputtered as merchants died mid-journey or refused to risk travel. The Hanseatic League, insulated by its broad network of cities, tightened its control even further, dictating the rhythm of commerce in Norway's ports. Each epidemic seemed to hand the kingdom more firmly into foreign hands. Norway's cultural life dimmed as well. Monasteries lost entire generations of monks, libraries went untended, manuscripts left unfinished. Songs that once echoed through village gatherings were silenced as communities dissolved. It was as if the nation's memory itself was being erased, its continuity shattered, its traditions buried with each new grave. For Haakon personally, the resurgence of the plague was a mirror of his reign. Both were cycles of effort undone by forces beyond control. He had tried to hold his kingdom together, and now he watched disease dismantle what little structure remained. His attempts at reform, his negotiations with merchants, his military defenses, all crumbled when confronted by the same invisible enemy that had haunted him since childhood. The imagery of this period is one of withering. Norway, once compared to a green meadow by medieval poets, had become a winter landscape. Skeletal trees, frozen soil, and fields where only crows lingered. Haakon himself must have felt like a shepherd watching his flock vanish, powerless to call them back. And yet, within this darkness, he clung to hope through his family. Olaf, though still a child, symbolized the possibility of renewal. Margaret, increasingly adept in politics, brought a steadiness that even the king leaned upon. Together, they were a fragile trinity at the heart of a crumbling kingdom. But the question loomed. Could even they withstand the tide that swept away all others? By the late 1370s, the plague had become more than a disease. It was a condition of life, a permanent resident in the kingdom. People adjusted to its rhythm, living with the constant awareness that tomorrow might bring fever, that each embrace might be the last. This was the world Haakon ruled, a world where every breath was a negotiation with fate. The return of the Black Death set the stage for the king's final chapter. He had survived his father's shadow, navigated alliances through marriage, endured economic decline, and cherished his role as father. But against this enemy, silent, unseen, relentless, his endurance would finally falter. The plague had taken Norway's people, its wealth, its strength. Soon, it would take its king. By the year 1380, Haakon VI had carried the weight of Norway for nearly 4 decades. He had endured his father's shadow, endured the intrusion of the Hanseatic League, endured famine and unrest, and endured the relentless return of the Black Death. But no endurance is infinite. In the late summer of that year, the invisible enemy that had stalked his people finally reached the king himself. The chronicles speak of fever. They describe Haakon confined within the walls of Oslo, his body racked with heat, his mind slipping in and out of delirium. The court physicians, bound by medieval medicine, prescribed purges, prayers, and potions of herbs steeped in wine. None of it mattered. The plague had entered the fortress, and once inside, no gate nor guard could drive it out. Outside, Oslo was tense and hushed. Rumors spread like fire. The king is ill. Some whispered it was divine punishment, others that it was simply fate. The king was mortal, no more immune than the farmers who died in their barns. For a kingdom already weakened, the illness of its sovereign was not just private grief. It was a tremor that shook the fragile foundation of governance itself. Within the chambers of Akershus fortress, the scene must have been heavy with silence, broken only by the coughs and groans of the king. Candlelight flickered against stone walls as servants moved cautiously, as though making too much noise might disturb the thin thread holding him to life. Margaret, his queen, would have been present, a woman not yet 30, suddenly faced with the imminent prospect of ruling alone. Their son Olaf, only 10 years old, was kept at a distance, shielded from the sight of a father diminished to frailty. The imagery of Haakon's decline is that of a once sturdy oak tree hollowed from within. On the outside, the crown still glittered, the banners still waved. But inside, disease consumed the core. Each passing day stripped away another layer of strength. His voice grew faint, his body weaker, until even sitting upright was beyond him. And yet, even in his weakness, Haakon carried dignity. Chroniclers note that he received sacraments, confessing sins and preparing his soul for departure. In an age when death was omnipresent, the rituals of the church offered a framework for meaning. For Haakon, who had lived through so much chaos, this final ritual may have been the only order left. His end was not marked by battle cries or clashing swords, but by whispered prayers, by the slow extinguishing of breath. On September 11th, 1380, at the age of 40, Haakon VI died. No trumpet announced it, no triumph accompanied it. The king who had been enthroned as a child, who had ruled through plague and famine, passed quietly in his chamber while the city outside held its breath. It was a death without spectacle, a vanishing more than a fall. The symbolism is poignant. Haakon, who had spent his life shielding a flickering flame, succumbed as that same flame was swallowed by darkness. His reign ended not in dramatic collapse, but in quiet expiration, the kind that feels less like an event and more like the slipping away of light at dusk. The aftermath was immediate. Bells tolled in Oslo, their echoes rolling across the fjord. Priests donned black vestments, chanting requiems for a king who had become less a figure of triumph than a figure of endurance. For the people, his death was not simply the loss of a sovereign. It was another reminder that no one, not even the crown, stood beyond the reach of plague. In the countryside, news of Haakon's passing spread slowly. Messengers rode across valleys and mountains, bearing tidings to villages where half the houses already lay abandoned. To those who still survived, the death of the king was received with resignation more than shock. After all, they too had buried fathers and sons, wives and children. The king's fate was merely their own fate writ large, the plague once more proving that crowns and commoners shared the same graveyard. For Margaret, the widow at 27, grief mingled with calculation. She had lost a husband, but she had also inherited responsibility. Her son Olaf was only 10. The burden of rule would fall squarely on her shoulders. In that moment of personal loss, she began the transformation from queen consort to the formidable ruler history would remember. The silence of Haakon's death became the prelude to Margaret's ascendancy. Olaf, the child king, was thrust into a role he could scarcely understand. His father had been a boy king once, and now history repeated itself. Yet Olaf's childhood was even more fragile, for he inherited not only a crown, but also a kingdom already in decline, tethered to his mother's will and the ambitions of Denmark. Haakon's burial was solemn, though not grand by the standards of earlier monarchs. The resources of the kingdom were too diminished for lavish ceremony. His body was laid to rest in Oslo, a king remembered not for victories, but for the endurance of a reign that bridged catastrophe after catastrophe. His grave became less a monument to triumph than a marker of survival. The death of Haakon VI is best understood as both an end and a threshold. It marked the end of Norway as an independent force in Northern Europe. It marked the threshold of the Kalmar Union, which would soon bind Denmark, Norway and Sweden under a single crown. His death was the quiet hinge upon which the history of Scandinavia turned. In silence, a man's life ended. In silence, a nation's independence began to dissolve. There is something profoundly fitting in this. Haakon's reign was never defined by noise or spectacle. It was defined by persistence in the face of forces larger than himself. His death reflected that same pattern, a quiet endurance giving way to quiet surrender. For Norway, the passing of Haakon VI was like the extinguishing of a candle in a vast cathedral already dimmed by plague. The smoke rose briefly, then vanished into shadows that would linger for centuries. The death of Haakon VI in September 1380 did not only close a life, it marked the turning of an age. What had once been Norway's fragile sovereignty began dissolving into the broader current of Scandinavian politics. The flame of an independent dynasty, already weak, sputtered further as the crown passed to a child, Olaf, barely 10 years old. Olaf's ascension was solemn rather than jubilant. In Oslo's halls, nobles bent the knee before a boy who could scarcely lift the scepter he was handed. His father's crown was lowered onto his head, heavy not only with gold, but with centuries of expectation. To the people, Olaf was a symbol, proof that the line of Magnus and Haakon endured. But beneath the symbolism was an unspoken fear. How long could a boy carry the weight that had bent grown men? In truth, Olaf did not rule. Margaret, his mother, stepped into the role of regent, and with her began the transformation of Norway's destiny. Where Haakon had struggled to steady the realm, Margaret wielded authority with precision. Her intelligence and political instinct allowed her to consolidate power swiftly, drawing Norway closer into Denmark's orbit. The marriage that had once been a diplomatic gamble now revealed its full consequence. Norway's independence was bound to Denmark not by conquest, but by kinship and necessity. The image of Olaf in these years is haunting. He appears in chronicles as a boy caught between play and duty, between childhood and sovereignty. His coronation robes were too long, dragging across the floor as if to remind him that kingship was always out of reach. When he appeared in public, he looked more like a pageant figure than a monarch. Behind him, it was Margaret's hand that moved the strings, her words that shaped policy, her vision that charted the course of the realm. The countryside felt the change quickly. Nobles and peasants alike realized that real authority no longer rested in Oslo alone. Decisions increasingly bore the stamp of Danish interest, woven into Margaret's strategy for uniting the northern crowns. What had once been a kingdom struggling to hold itself together now became part of a larger weave, its threads absorbed into a broader tapestry. The tragedy of Olaf was not his coronation, but his brevity. In 1387, just 7 years after his father's death, Olaf himself died at the age of 17. The cause remains uncertain: illness, perhaps fever, perhaps one more shadow of the plague. But the result was clear. The direct male line of Norway's dynasty was extinguished. A father gone at 40, a son gone before manhood. The crown, instead of being a beacon of continuity, had become a funeral torch passed from hand to hand, burning shorter with each flame. Olaf's death left Margaret in undisputed control. She seized the moment with decisiveness, taking command not only of Norway, but also of Denmark. In 1389, she extended her influence into Sweden as well, defeating rivals and securing recognition. By 1397, she would preside over the creation of the Kalmar Union, a political union binding Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under one crown. It was a triumph for her, but a quiet burial for Norway's independence. For Norway, the loss of Olaf was more than the loss of a boy king. It was the loss of a dynasty's promise. the extinguishing of the last ember that had glowed through generations of Magnusson rule. With Olaf's passing, Norway ceased to be a sovereign player in its own right and became instead a component in Margaret's grand design. The symbolism of these years is stark. Imagine Norway as a fortress whose walls had been battered by plague and famine. Haakon, with weary arms, had tried to hold the gates closed. With his death, the gates swung open, and through them walked not enemies with swords, but relatives with crowns. Olaf, too fragile to defend the fortress, was carried away before he could even choose his weapon. What remained was Margaret, who took the keys and used them to lock the fortress into a larger empire. And yet, Margaret's rise did not erase the memory of Haakon and Olaf. To the people of Norway, their deaths were reminders of fragility, of how easily dynasties crumbled. In sagas and chronicles, Haakon's name remained tied to endurance, Olaf's to lost potential. Together, they represented the twilight of a line, the father who died too young, the son who never grew old. The Kalmar Union, though hailed in its day as a unifying triumph, carried with it the seeds of discontent. For Norwegians, it meant centuries of subordination, centuries where their voice was muffled within a chorus led by Denmark. Haakon's death had been the first step, Olaf's the second. With Margaret's hand guiding the wheel, Norway's course was set not by its own kings, but by the designs of others. What makes this moment so tragic is not only what was lost, but how it was lost. There was no grand invasion, no shattering battle where Norway fell. Instead, its independence slipped away quietly, like sand through open fingers. A father's death from plague, a son's untimely passing, and a queen's ambition. That was all it took. Dynasties are often broken by violence. Norway's was dissolved by silence. Looking back, one cannot help but see the pattern. Haakon, enthroned at 3, never fully escaped the shadow of others. His son, crowned at 10, never lived long enough to cast a shadow of his own. Both lives were bounded by fragility, by circumstances beyond their control, by the cruel arithmetic of fate. And with their deaths, Norway itself became a ghost of sovereignty. Its independence remembered, but no longer real. A dynasty had ended, a union had begun. And in that transition lies the quiet tragedy of Norway, not conquered, but absorbed, not destroyed, but diminished. The death of Haakon VI was more than the ending of a life. It was proof of how plague could bend the arc of history. For centuries, dynasties had risen and fallen through war, betrayal, or conquest. But in the 14th century, the Black Death proved itself a conqueror greater than any army. It had already emptied villages and silenced cities. Now it toppled a king, and with him, the fragile independence of his realm. If Haakon had lived another decade, Norway might have stood longer as a separate force. With Olaf at his side, he might have preserved a semblance of sovereignty, perhaps balancing alliances with Denmark and Sweden while resisting the Hanseatic League. But plague does not bargain. It strikes without strategy, without diplomacy, without concern for dynasties or dreams. In claiming Haakon, it erased not only a man, but the political possibility he embodied. History is often imagined as a series of deliberate choices, kings making decisions, generals leading armies, councils drafting treaties. Yet the plague reminds us that history can also be shaped by absence, by the hands that no longer sign decrees, by the voices that no longer speak in council halls, by the rulers who vanish before their work is done. Haakon's reign was undone not by defeat in battle, but by fever in a bedchamber. The metaphor of Norway at this time is of a ship losing its captain in the midst of storm. The vessel was already damaged, its sails tattered, its hull leaking. But while Haakon stood at the helm, there was at least direction. His death left only a boy too young to steer and a widow whose ambitions pulled the ship into another fleet entirely. The storm did not sink Norway outright. It absorbed it into larger waters until the vessel no longer sailed alone. Plague, in this sense, was both executioner and architect. It executed individuals, farmers, priests, nobles, kings, but in so doing, it also built the foundations of new orders. The Kalmar Union, the eventual dominance of Denmark, the centuries of Norwegian subordination. All these were the structures erected upon the graves dug by plague. Haakon's passing was not an isolated tragedy. It was a brick in a much larger wall reshaping Europe. Even beyond Norway, his fate was emblematic. Throughout Europe, dynasties faltered under the same invisible weight. In England, in France, in the Holy Roman Empire, rulers confronted the same enemy that swords could not touch. It was a leveling force, humbling castles and cottages alike. The Black Death demonstrated with merciless clarity that history's course could hinge not only on human ambition, but on microbes unseen by the eye. And so, Haakon's death offers a lens through which to see the 14th century. It was an age when kingship itself was fragile, when sovereignty could vanish, not with a battle, but with a breath. His death shows us that the boundary between personal fate and national destiny is thin, almost transparent. When a king succumbed to plague, an entire kingdom shifted course. What remains most haunting is the silence. There was no clash of arms, no resounding victory cry, only fever, delirium, and stillness. The silence of his chamber echoed outward, silencing a dynasty, silencing Norway's independence, silencing the possibility of another path. In that silence, history turned. In the centuries that followed, Haakon VI faded into the background of European history. He left no dramatic battlefield legacy, no sweeping reforms to echo through time. Instead, his reign became a symbol of endurance during collapse, his death a marker of how fragile even the highest crowns could be when weighed against plague and fate. Norway remembers him not as a conqueror, but as the last sovereign of a truly independent line. For the people of his time, memory was steeped in grief. His death was folded into the long chain of funerals that defined the 14th century. To peasants who had buried families in shallow graves, the king's passing felt strangely familiar. Another life extinguished, another light gone out, another sign that no one, however exalted, was spared. In this way, Haakon became less distant, less untouchable. He was not a figure beyond reach. He was kin to their own losses. Over the years, the narrative of Norway shifted. The Kalmar Union came to dominate. Denmark's influence grew, and Norway's voice grew quieter. Yet the memory of Haakon's reign lingered like a faint candle in a dark corridor. His was the age when Norway stood on the edge, when the line of Magnus and Haakon flickered before being swallowed by the designs of others. To recall his story was to recall the moment when independence gave way to entanglement. Modern historians sometimes call him the Forgotten King, overshadowed by Margaret's brilliance and Olaf's tragedy. But forgetfulness does not erase significance. His life reminds us that history is not always shaped by great victories. It is often shaped by survival, by the quiet endurance of those who hold on until they can hold on no longer. The metaphor of Haakon's Norway is that of a twilight sky, not the sudden darkness of nightfall, but the gradual dimming when light clings to the horizon even as shadows deepen. His reign was that twilight, a slow fading of independence, a quiet surrender to forces too vast for one man to resist. Yet twilight is also beautiful, carrying with it a dignity that lingers even after the sun has set. Today, walking the streets of Oslo or looking across the fjords, one might not see monuments to Haakon VI on the scale of other rulers. His legacy is subtler, woven into the very story of Norway's endurance. His reign teaches that even in loss, there is resilience. Even in decline, there is dignity. He was the king who did not conquer, but who endured, who did not expand, but who preserved what little could be preserved until his body, like his kingdom, could bear no more. Haakon VI's death at 40 was not just a private tragedy. It was the hinge on which Norway's history turned. His memory is the memory of a kingdom that once stood alone, then slipped into silence, its independence buried beside him. And yet, in remembering him, Norway reclaims that story, honors that endurance, and acknowledges the quiet courage of a king who faced the inevitable with dignity.